Hello and welcome to the Kryptonaut Podcast. I'm Mark Storrs, and with me as always is
Rob Morphy.
We have a very special guest this episode, straight out of quarantine, directly into social isolation, Mr. Nikolaus Cox. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, guys. Been better, but very glad to talk to you now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to talk with me and Rob. Actually, Nikolaus got a hold of me on our Patreon, and he recently came back from a trip he's going to be telling us about. But yeah, real quick, Nikolaus, why don't you just give us a little bit of info about yourself, some background, where you've been, and what kind of what you got going on now.
Okay, yeah. So I, until coronavirus made our lives awful, I was an archaeologist with the University of Cambridge. I used to study there, and then I started working for their archaeology unit, mainly doing research in and around Britain, archaeological research into Roman ruins and things like that. But through I got onto this through a family friend, but I realized that there were these Second World War ruins out in the Solomon Islands on this island called Kolombangara. There are these Japanese wartime tunnels and dugouts that no one had ever been to or seen since the Japanese evacuated the island in 1943. And conflict archaeology, so that's like modern archaeology done into like modern or comparatively modern conflicts, is actually a sort of burgeoning part of the field. And, a lot of people do research into the Second World War and the First World War, but no one had ever gone out here. I mean, the Solomon Islands are a pretty isolated island chain in the Western Pacific. Very little people go out there. No one goes to this island called Kolombangara. As I found out later, it's literally just a forestry settlement and then local populations living as subsistence farmers. But I knew a family friend who'd worked there in 1995. He was the first non-islander to see these Japanese ruins, but no one's ever done anything with them. So on top of working for the university, I began crowdfunding and sort of ended up launching my own expedition to the island of Kolombangara in the Solomon Islands, leading a small team to investigate and record for the first time these Japanese wartime tunnels that they sort of dug in preparation, expecting an American assault that actually never happened, and they were just full of artifacts. So that was kind of like that's what I've been doing recently. I got back to Britain. I got back to Australia, rather, after the Solomon Islands, and switched my phone on for the first time on the 2-week expedition to find that the world had basically caught fire while I've been away.
Oh man! So you came back directly into the coronavirus.
Oh, it was just picking up. People were just starting to hoard toilet paper and it was during my overnight stay in Australia before I flew on again that America began closing its borders to Britain, and I flew to New Zealand for a day because I was visiting my family, and I got in there about 5 hours before New Zealand closed its borders to outsiders. I flew out and managed to get back to Britain before Britain closed its borders, and I've been in my room ever since.
And here you are,
and here
now
I am.
on the Kryptonaut Podcast.
Yeah, I listen to the podcast every time I go jogging, and
nice.
It was great. I came back and I put on the podcast, and I realized you guys had said some amazingly nice things about me while I'd been sort of out of the world, and I reached out to you and I was like, hey, thank you so much for the shout out, and maybe I have some things that might interest the more cryptozoologically inclined of you guys. So yeah, that's how we got to know each other.
Well, it's absolutely
totally
fascinating, first off, to be talking to a legitimate globe-trotting archaeologist. I mean, that is just Fat City as far as I'm concerned. You are living the dream. It's like you are the Indiana Jones equivalent in terms of what I'm aspiring towards, and I really think it's awesome. I mean, it sucks too that you leave the world for a while and you come back and, as you say, find it on fire. So you got to say to yourself, what did I do? I'm gone for a hot 10 minutes and everything shits the bed.
It was
but none of us blame
weeks.
you, Nick. I just want you to know.
Yeah, I'm definitely not patient zero. In fact, to my knowledge, the Solomon Islands still remain COVID-19 free. They get so little sort of traffic and tourism going through those islands that they haven't actually really picked up on travelers that have picked up the virus in China and distributed it. So no one's yet arrived in the Solomon Islands and spread the virus. So as far as safe places to be, I can, recommend the Solomon Islands.
Now that's one of those, and I'm sure I'm right when I say this, one of the most isolated places where there is human habitation. Would you say that's correct?
It is absolutely true. The Pacific is half the planet is the Pacific Ocean, and you just get these island chains out there. And New Zealand, which is where I'm from, is actually one of the most isolated, but due to its size, it has enough of a population to be a pretty developed place. But then you get these scattered island chains out there that are just miles away from anywhere, just tiny atolls and volcanoes. It's about as far as the edge of the world as you could get, which my team told me many times during our period out there. I mean, we every night power would go off at 10 p.m. We'd be sitting around in darkness, and you just hear the crickets and the frogs outside in the jungle. We're in this little cabin, and my team would just like, Nick, this is the edge of the world. There's nothing. There's nothing here. This is like beyond this. It's just ocean. It was amazing. Yeah, and thank you so much for saying. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say thank you so much for saying I'm a globe-trotting archaeologist, because that's been my dream for so long. And I mean, most archaeologists, including myself, we spend our time sort of working. I work in Britain. Most of my co-workers, we all work in Britain. We don't really traverse the globe, but I just got the inspiration, got the idea, and Matt was lucky enough to crowdfund and raise enough money to do this. But this is new for me too. This is not my bread and butter, is being the globe-trotting Indiana Jones that you so wonderfully said I was, and I'm very grateful that you said that.
Every Indiana has to start somewhere, man.
Yeah,
exactly.
Totally.
You've started the fire. Let's see where the conflagration goes.
And also, too, Nikolaus, now your website, that's ForgottenFortress.com, correct?
Yeah, ForgottenFortress.com.
Okay.
I do need to update it. I have not updated it since I got back. But there's a lot to update on there. So there's going to be a lot of stuff going up in the next week. That's going to be new, original, a lot of footage, maps, photos, and journal entries that are first of their kind.
Yeah, so if people want to check you out, they can find you there, and you're also available on the social medias. I know that you got an Instagram account.
Yeah.
Cool.
I can definitely shout that out at the end of the episode. I can do it now if you want as well.
Yeah, drop it now, and then we can drop it later. Just to ask people to listen, and they can kind of check it out.
Yeah, well, firstly, check out the Cryptonaut podcast. It's fantastic. But also, if you're so inclined, on Instagram, I'm Nick Swift Diggs. That's NIKSWIFT I have recently launched a TeePublic page because I need to make money somehow during this time. So I'm doing archaeology-inspired T-shirts by archaeologists for archaeologists. That's Nick Swift Draws. That's NIKSWIFT DRAWS. I'm also on Twitter as Nick and Daniel, which is something my friend Daniel and I made in college that is still my official Twitter account.
Awesome.
So yeah, that's social media I'm on.
And
awesome.
Cool. Not to interrupt you there, Mark, but I will say, just for the record, you are a hell of an illustrator, Nick, too. So definitely check out those designs, man. I loved
thank you so much.
The images that you incorporated in with this, the story that we're going to get into in a minute. And to me, it's an all-around talent, so it's definitely worth checking out that TeePublic shop.
Thank you so much. I've actually already launched a T-shirt which has it makes reference to what we're going to be discussing today. I was quite proud of my illustration, so I incorporated it into a T-shirt design. So there will be a little bit of a crossover there.
Awesome. All right, man. So Nick, why don't you get us into some cryptozoology here? What do you got for us, buddy?
So let me just bring up my version of the document as well, so make sure I don't drop anything. But I mean, you guys are going to be asking me a lot of questions, I imagine, but one of the things I'd picked up on before I went to Columbangra, because I mean, I am a professional archaeologist, but I've always been fascinated by cryptozoology. I'm not a skeptic. I'm not a believer either necessarily. I just I want to believe in everything, but I want to see evidence for it. I guess that makes me boring and not fun, but that's the way I kind of approach this thing.
It's science.
Yeah, I definitely approach it from a scientific perspective. It's why I'm always more space than I am hell, to make a reference to what you guys talk about a lot. Because I'm always I feel everything.
Awesome.
Yeah, everything can be explained by it's like a higher science. It's just a science we don't yet get, or it's a species we haven't yet discovered. And I know Rob says this a lot, so I hope I'm ticking some boxes.
No, you are definitely making me proud right now.
Thank you. So I've always been into this. I've always been into cryptozoology. I remember when I was 12 or 11, we were actually at Loch Ness, and I was so sure I was going to be the one that found the Loch Ness Monster. We went to this very convincing exhibition right before we went out on the lake, which made it very clear it's highly unlikely a plesiosaur could still be alive in Loch Ness. And 12-year-old me was devastated. But I was still confident that I would be the one to find it. And I remember I saw a shape out on the lake, and I pointed, and everyone on the boat looked. And it was a fisherman hunched over the back of his boat. And people looked at me like,
oh man.
They looked at me like, this fucking kid is just like having a go. I'm like, no, guys, I really thought I saw something that time. The thing is, I've always wanted to believe in that, but I got to go where the science leads me, and that's like part of like archaeology. Archaeology is sort of like, I love sort of learning these fascinating, sort of implausible stories about human life, but you learn it through the science that is backed up by it. But in my research into Columbangara, before I went out there, I stumbled across this story about how Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal apparently were being, during the Battle of Guadalcanal, were being terrorized by not just the American Marines pushing their way northwards, but also by these giant hairy hominins that apparently in the interior part of Guadalcanal, as the Japanese retreated inland, began to encounter. They ranged in height from about 10 to 15 feet, big, hairy,
that's
monstrous.
Just nuts. That's like off the charts for even like Yeti, certainly traditional Bigfoot or Sasquatch reports.
I want to say it's much too big, and I feel. I mean, we might get into this later. I definitely in the article I sent to you guys, which maybe we can distribute somehow online so other people can read it. But I definitely feel in the article I sent to you, like, I don't think these heights are plausible, because if there was a humanoid creature 15 feet high, like we would have to know about it. That's not something that can stay hidden. These islands are large, but they're not so big that a 15-foot tall creature. But I like to think that people exaggerate the size of animals because of, they see something very large and it scares them. And so they start, bigging it up in their mind. It's always the fisherman's tale kind of thing. I don't think they weren't not seeing something. I just feel it probably wasn't as large as they say it was.
Right. But
I could read my piece to you if you want, my article. And that's
Please.
how I could sort of present this. In 7th of August, 1942, the Americans land at Guadalcanal. It's the first ever sort of physical contact the Japanese and the Americans are having in the Second World War. I mean, prior to this, you've got Midway, you've got Pearl Harbor. These are attacks being made by the air and by sea, but this is the first time ever that people are actually coming into conflict with each other. So the war in the Solomon Islands is actually pretty significant, although it's often overlooked. Like Guadalcanal is the first time Americans are fighting Japanese. And they're fighting, one island at a time, just sort of driving the enemy northwards. And here's what I've got written. Anyway, traversing the deep rainforest of Guadalcanal's interior and prolonging the bloody slogging match with the Americans, the Japanese soldiers began reporting terrifying encounters with giant, hairy men. These towering entities could be up to 10 feet high and were covered in long black or reddish-brown hair with prominent brows, flat noses, double eyebrows. I don't know what a double eyebrow is, but
it's amazing.
I just, is it like one eyebrow above the other one, just like extra hairy? I don't know what that is. Double eyebrows, red eyes. This is another thing that I might take issue with. We can get into that later. I just feel all scary things have red eyes. I think maybe that's a creation. Also, certain things, if you shine a light in the eye, it reflects back red. So that might be a part of it. Red eyes and wide mouths. They had long arms, which they put to brutal effect, breaking apart the undergrowth, and wielded crude stone clubs and cudgels. These Melanesian monstrosities were reported to be quite aggressive and often attack the Japanese soldiers they encountered. Several units reported these hairy hominids would erupt from the dense undergrowth to fall upon the terrified men, physically assaulting them, while other groups attested that the creatures, though not on the offensive, would rip apart small trees in terrifying displays of physical strength. Bullets had little apparent effect on them, as is forever the way with people fighting monsters.
Absolutely.
You can't shoot them; they're bulletproof.
They have to be bulletproof. I mean, you never get a monster from the last ice age that actually can be brought down by a pistol. That's just not fun.
No.
And bullets had little effect on them. It only darkened their demeanor and the estimation of the Japanese interlopers. The men of Imperial Japan, for their part, were driven to distraction by the cryptozoological presence that harried and haunted them throughout their horrible jungle ordeal. Young soldiers far from home and already in a state of heightened stress and anxiety, thanks to American aircraft screaming overhead and flamethrower-wielding U.S. Marines pushing them ever deeper into the jungle, were now unable to sleep at night due to the inhuman howls and wails that reverberated off the trees, coupled with the crash and thrash of these primordial behemoths moving through the undergrowth close to the Japanese positions. And so that's the story I came across in my research.
That's cinematic. Wow. That's incredible. That smacks of the folklore that has come down to us throughout the ages, and yet it has that decidedly modern appeal that it took place in the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
And
it's in a
first off, I'm
concrete
pissed
time
John
period.
Wayne never made a movie about it. That's the first thing.
John Wayne just sort of fighting the Japanese, and then he's fighting these guerrillas, or he teams up with them. You know, they work together.
Of course, he teams up with the Monster Men. John Wayne and the Monster Men fighting the evil Japanese Imperial Navy Empire. Come on!
Oh, it'd be amazing.
It writes
John Wayne
itself.
John Wayne and this gorilla spelled differently, but it doesn't come across out loud. But there's gorilla and John Wayne. They look at each other, and for a moment there's animosity, but then they realize they have a mutual shared enemy, and they turn to look at the Japanese general that's wielding his sword in that moment, and that's when the story picks up.
Oh my god, I picture it all.
Yeah, it's just like that.
And beautiful letterbox. Why did this never happen? History aside, cinema lost one of its greatest angles.
Yeah, seriously.
Right?
So I was curious real quick here, Rob, what is the story that we talked about it briefly, but we never actually covered it. It was the canyon where there was people, they were like in like a house on a canyon, and they were attacked like 3 days or something
like
by
Ape Canyon or something. I figure it took place in the Pacific Northwest of the Americas,
right.
And these people were assaulted all night long. They apparently shot something that to them resembled a gorilla. This was somewhere in the 19th century, so I don't know exactly when. So that was their only frame of reference, is images they might have seen, I guess, or in zoos or in the newspaper drawings of a gorilla. Okay. And then they shot one, and then all night long they were harassed, rocks thrown, beating on the walls. And
rock throwing is really common with Bigfoot stories, isn't it?
Oh, very, very common.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yep.
Wood knocking, rock throwing. And a lot of times it seems to be either playfully or to get attention. Rarely does it seem to be actively assaultive, at least in my experience. Then, of course, if it is, they will hit their mark and completely annihilate anyone they hit. Therefore, there'll be no story to tell. So maybe half the time it is mean-spirited, and we'll just never know. They'll just blame it on an avalanche or something.
Well, yeah, I would imagine, like, if a Bigfoot smashes me with a stone, I'm just going to be like a splat mark with like fucking
you're a skid mark. You're nothing.
Yeah, you're nothing left of you.
You're brain matter on a rock. That's all that's left of you at that point.
I mean, it actually kind of has. Sorry, Nikolaus.
I was just going to say, I've heard stories of like Arctic explorers who are being like stalked by baby polar bears, and these polar bears are just curious, but one swat with a baby polar bear's paw is going to eviscerate a man. So they don't have to be aggressive to just fuck you up.
That's so true. That's so true.
It's actually sort of almost in like a comic book sense. It reminds me of like Gorilla Grodd with his army of intelligent gorillas.
Oh yeah,
from the Flash. Yeah,
well, I saw that. That brings me back to the Solomon stories. These creatures smack not of what a lot of people seem to presume Bigfoot and its ilk are, which are, I don't personally subscribe to the Gigantopithecus theory, because I think anything that big and completely animalistic would absolutely give itself away almost anywhere in the world.
In my mind, it has to be like a small hominid or human. Sorry, continue.
No, please interrupt me anytime you're right. And I would 100% agree with that assessment, Nick. But the creatures that you read about on these islands, when you get a little deeper into it, as you said in your readings, wield cudgels and other weapons. It seems to me more like we're talking about perhaps a proto-human, or I get we were talking before the pod how hominid and hominin, and it gets all confusing.
Hominoid. Oh my god.
Hominoid, exactly, one of my favorites. But that it seems like it's an intelligent creature, which is not to say chimps and orangs can't show real signs of intelligence, but like human-like intelligence, like perhaps.
I agree entirely, and I think we're going to get into this later, because I like as you've seen from my article, like there's actually a lot of like I've got of opinions about this, and also some anecdotal evidence that backs up exactly what you're saying. Like Gigantopithecus is a fun idea, but I definitely feel if these creatures are anything, they're sentient. There is the potential they could. I think either they're an orangutan species that has not yet been encountered, or this is a sentient, separate strain of archaic like hominin that has just survived all the extinctions that wiped out other species of Homo in the last 2 million years. And I think that is it's one or the other, because they're too sentient. They make tools. They communicate with each other. And we'll get into this further. We'll get into the folklore. But these things think. There is something going on there that I think it implies that they are proto-humans.
Right.
If the stories are to be believed.
Of course, that's always the caveat we have to throw in there.
It's always the caveat, yeah.
But just going, for the sake of it, on that we suppose that these accounts are at least based somewhat on reality. What better place than an island? I mean, look at New Zealand. I mean, your homeland. Madagascar, on and on. For the preservation of a species that is not destined to survive broadly on the other continents. And where evolution takes hold and greater swaths of progression occur. Islands are the perfect place for relic species to endure. Yeah. Would you agree?
I would agree entirely. I mean, it's only like human movement and the ability to build boats, and so it is human intervention that has made the world seem so small. But on the whole, if a species is washed out to an island and it starts to survive on that island, it will speciate. It will become a separate species to whatever it used to be on the other landmass it comes from. I mean, islands are the perfect. I mean, look at the Galapagos. It's just like a big crock pot full of evolution out there. I mean, this is just islands are the place where these kind of things happen, and these species develop and form and go off on their own tangents and are preserved. And if you look at New Zealand, as you said, I mean, the tuatara is often called a living fossil, in that all of the tuatara is a species of barely. I think they come under reptile, but they're not lizard. Historically, they're called ranchocephalians. I think they actually have a new scientific name, but I don't know the new name. I just remember ranchocephalian. Ranchocephalian was a type of reptile that was found all over the world in the Permian and the Triassic. But now the only ranchocephalian left is the tuatara, which is a species of reptile that's found only on New Zealand. They're really weird. When they're born, they actually have 3 eyes. They have a third eye on top of their head, and this eye closes up as they get older and as they develop. They're an incredibly unique species of reptile. And exactly as you say, this is a living fossil. It is a species that used to be found widespread. It's not found anywhere else now, but thanks to just the nature of being isolated on an island, that until human interference was completely cut off from the world, the species was able to prosper and survive and develop and evolve.
That should be a poster child for cryptozoology, every bit as much as the coelacanth or any of the other discovered creatures or rediscovered creatures.
The coelacanth is another example. A coelacanth is a prime example. Exactly. Yeah.
No, it's fantastic. So we are in agreement that I think, and we'll get more into this, because that it's likely to be something smarter than your average ape. Not to belittle apes, because I'm all about our ape audience. But also
most of the Patreon subscribers,
they're the best. You can always rely on them in a pinch.
I do not take any offense to it, Robert. Thank you.
God bless you. and that islands are these great pockets of isolation where things can evolve of their own accord and not necessarily have to be bred out or murdered out of existence.
Exactly. So we've seen it happen so many times, so it is not impossible. It happens here. You cannot rule it out. Absolutely not. Yeah.
Now, there's different kinds of legends. There's these supergiants, but there's also a smaller strain found throughout the island. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing. I found the separate account, which has never before, I think, been associated with the Giants of Guadalcanal. I mean, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of indigenous stories about these giants. I mean, the Japanese apparently had to fight them, but locals up till this day have stories of encounters with Guadalcanal giants. But then when I was doing research again into this expedition, trying to sort of understand the historical context I was working into, because to understand the Second World War ruins, you have to understand the Second World War on the Solomon Islands. I came across the island of Malaita, and on the island of Malaita, there are these stories of these 4 to 5 foot tall, red-haired hominids that would come out of the forest and steal bananas. And it was mentioned in a single sentence in an article I read. There's nothing else around there. But I was like, that's interesting, because that sounds like a smaller version of the Giants of Guadalcanal. And I mentioned this when I was actually on Columbangara doing my archaeological research. And people were like, oh, it sounds like you're talking about Kakamora. And if anyone here has watched the Disney film Moana, I don't know if you guys have, but that film...
I have, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Well, yeah, you've got kids, Mark, so of course you've watched Moana.
Yeah, they love Moana. I sing the songs constantly.
I have not had the privilege, so this is going to be new information for me.
So I love the film Moana because the mythology I had to learn in high school is what forms the basis of the story of Moana, because it is just a sort of a catalogue of myths and legends of Polynesia. So it was really powerful to watch. But one thing I didn't understand, because we don't learn about it in New Zealand, was the Kakamora, who feature in Moana as these little sort of coconut-looking guys. But the Kakamora come from the Solomon Islands, and in mythology, they are small, hairy hominids, 4 to 5 foot tall, very much like the apes that apparently steal bananas on Malaysia. Now, the Kakamora are mainly found on the island of Makira. Yeah, Makira Island, which was historically called San Cristobal. And most of the folklore surrounding Kakamora comes from Makira. It's a very interesting little thing. I mean, aside from their size, which is, 4 to 5 foot as opposed to 10 to 15 feet, all their other descriptors, their physical descriptors, are pretty much identical to the Giants of Guadalcanal. They're reddish brown to black. They're hairy. Their fur can hang down below their knees. They have humanoid features. They do have sharp claw-like hands. They've been known to attack humans, who they can kill with their nail-like, with their blade-like nails. Their odor is disgusting, which is interesting because, so many stories of hairy hominids around the world focus on a bad smell. I'm not saying
it's nearly ubiquitous, yeah.
It is nearly ubiquitous, like every single Sasquatch. I don't know about the Yeti so much, but all the North American apes, the skunk ape and everything, they all stink, apparently. Well, I don't know what that means, but this is the same thing here. The Kakamora also stink. Unlike their giant cousins on Guadalcanal, they're not bulletproof. And apparently the most sensitive places around their buttocks, but I think that's true for anything. That's not particularly...
So you got to shoot it in the ass? Is that what you're saying?
Apparently... Well, I think you can shoot them anywhere. It's just that their ass is the most sensitive part of their body. But if I was shot in the ass, I would react much like a Kakamora, I think. I'd be pretty pissed off about it.
Yeah, no, I would definitely... that'd be it for me. It'd be over.
No, yeah, exactly.
No, a good SWAT, and I think I'm acquiescing to anything you want at that point. Yeah, no, you won.
Yeah, I back down. Like, you have a gun and you shot me in my ass, bro. That fucking kills.
Dude, for real? For real?
I'm sorry I stole your bananas, dude. Yeah. Jesus Christ.
Oh, I know.
Because the Kakamora, much like the Malaysian entities, these apes, are stealing produce from plantations. And interestingly, Kakamora have a developed language, and apparently they appreciate music, which they play with a conch shell. And it's apparently very primitive and eerie music, but apparently they are known to indulge in blowing a conch shell, which is the most primitive form of an instrument, really. You just blow into a shell and it makes a noise. So maybe they're more interested in the noise rather than actually making music. And I think if you consider the fact that the Giants of Guadalcanal apparently, they make stone tools, and we can get into their habitats in a minute. But the fact that, Giants of Guadalcanal are making stone tools, and allegedly they live in sort of nested areas, they make shelters underground. And then the Kakamora, not necessarily making tools, but they've developed language, they can appreciate music, and they also make sort of shelters. They shelter in trees, but they also live underground more than just on Makira. They actually live underground in Guadalcanal, which is interesting because all accounts say that the Kakamora and the Giants, when they feature in Guadalcanal folklore, they all live in the same limestone karstic system in the center of Guadalcanal, which for me suggests that these aren't two different entities, but they're just the same entity. Maybe it's sexual dimorphism, but more likely I feel it's just difference in age of the same
kids.
Hominid. Yeah, it's just the Kakamora kids. Maybe the giants are adults, and maybe they have more of a sense, let's not mess with the humans, let's stick to our habitat and they'll stick to theirs, which does seem to be the way of the giants. The giants don't mess with you unless you go into their territory. The Kakamora, they're behaving like children, they're more sort of curious and inquisitive. They're going off into human territory and, stealing their fruit. And something interesting I think would be worth mentioning here is that some people say that the Kakamora exist as a myth to, warn people against going to the interior. A thing you have to realize about the Solomon Islands is that almost the entire population live on the coast. No one lives inland on these islands. These aren't atolls, by and large. These are mountainous sort of archipelagos. They're volcanic in origin. And the interiors are just valleys, mountains, craggy peaks, thick rainforest. I try to walk there one day.
Incredibly inhospitable is what you're saying.
It is inhospitable. So the humans will live along the coast, and these entities live in the interior. And often the the argument is raised that Kakamora exist as a warning, saying don't go into this inhospitable territory. There's no food, water is hard to come by, it could be poisoned, watch out for Kakamora. But there's this interesting account, which I'm going to look for in my writings here. But these apparently mythical rainforest denizens actually have a lot of anthropological accounts written about them. Some anthropologists out in the 1920s, Dr. C.E. Fox and Dr. F.H. Drew, described the Kakamora in their anthropological study, which they later named Beliefs and Tales of San Cristobal, which is the colonial name for Makira Island. They described all the physical characteristics that I've described to you, which, as we've noted, is very similar to the giants. They also described their diet, which is nuts, ripe fruits, opossums, which apparently they're fond of. But they also consume human flesh in some cases, which is again similar to the mythology of the giants. Some giants, but not all giants, will eat human flesh. But beyond this, what I find very interesting is that when locals first acquired firearms in the early 1900s, Kakamora sightings and stories declined rapidly. They kind of dropped off completely. But in the 1920s, the colonial authorities banned locally owned weapons. It's a colonial thing. I think they didn't want too many armed indigenous people. The British were pretty inhospitable towards their colonial subjects in the Solomon Islands, and they tried to sort of enforce gun control, and they started banning locally owned weapons. And within a matter of months, sightings began to increase again. So after guns were being taken away from local people, these animals start reappearing, and they're now being found looting plantations to steal bananas and other fruit and things like this. And I think if these creatures were a fabrication...
Their asses are finally safe, so who can blame them?
Well, exactly. Finally, their asses are no longer...
They're going to come back, ass protected.
They're going to come back. Their asses are assured, thanks to the colonial government.
That is kind of interesting, though, that, how whatever happened, as far as this gun control, that they actually kind of caught wind of it.
Yeah.
Where they're like, you know what? It's like, it's safe again. It's weird.
It's almost like...
Yeah, that's intriguing.
When the hunting in the rainforests became less common, and presumably humans are less frequently going hunting because there's less things to hunt when you don't have a gun, that the Kakamora start to come back. And I think that's incredibly prescient, because if these are meant to be just a mythical creature that warns you against the inhospitable interior, why are they being affected by the changing socio-political situation of the island and the decline in hunting? If this is just a folkloric creature, then the British colonial authorities banning guns for political reasons surely shouldn't affect whether they feature in accounts or not. But it does, which makes them seem a lot more like a tangible entity.
Yeah, totally. Oh, that's bizarre. Wow.
Which is that I think that is like really quite interesting, because most of the stories about the giants, you can also sort of say, oh, it's folkloric stories, warning people against going into the interior. But
right.
The Kakamora are being affected by the practices of very tangible and real hunters. And locals can give incredibly detailed accounts, not folkloric, not sort of like mythical accounts, but very prosaic scientific accounts of what these creatures look like and what their diet consists of to foreign anthropologists. So I think it's sort of...
Yeah, you don't usually... get that in the context of purely fictional beings. They eat sunbeams and shit rainbows, and they just do whatever they're going to do. And they are absolutely unaffected by whether or not the local populace is well armed or not.
Yeah, regardless of whether, I mean, if they have guns, the guns have no effect on them. That's how it works. But here the guns do, which makes them seem so much more tangible. I mean, I'm thinking about an episode you guys did about the Snallygaster. The Snallygaster is so incomprehensible in its description and its general resistance to what people are doing towards it. And, you sort of think, well, maybe it comes from another reality. Maybe it's a creature from another dimension. Maybe it's entirely fictive. But the Kakamora and the giants sound a lot like apes or hominids, rather, that we're aware of, and they seem to be genuinely affected by the behavior of local populations in a way that I feel makes them far less mythical.
You also point out in your excellent report, which I love, like I say, really well written on this phenomenon in general. You pointed out something which I found to be interesting from a cryptozoological point of view, and that is you mentioned the Congo's Mukele Mbembe, which is famous, and I'm sort of just rereading your words when I say this, famously believed to be a sauropod-style dinosaur living in like the Lukwala swamp and other deep recesses of the Congo. But I've always found that as much as I want there to be living dinosaurs, and this I think agree with, because I'm reading it in your piece right now, there's no reason to assume that even if it is something of the lineage of dinosaurs that managed to survive in some isolated geographical pocket and not be affected by all the great changes in the world around it, that it would still be the dinosaur of old. And I feel the same about Nessie. I've never really bought the plesiosaur idea, as much as I love the idea that it could be this aquatic.
I love these ideas.
I know the ideas are they appeal to not only the child in all of us, but just the open-minded, imaginative being in all of us, whether that be something divine or something just plain old biological. We all have some of it, and we want these extraordinary things to be possible.
We want to believe.
But to me, it never made a lick of sense logically that that's what it would be. That there could be unknown species of, as you say, possibly elephant, or maybe even just elephants mistaken from a distance, or unknown, or perhaps some sort of relic species of rhino or something that, I'm going to say the word wrong, but like the Amelduca or something like that. There are plenty of great stories, but we don't necessarily have to assume that we're talking about a brontosaurus and a triceratops.
No. My personal theory is that it's a pygmy rhino, personally. I think pygmy rhino.
There you go. That makes sense. And why not? I mean, we've had pygmy elephants. I believe they're extinct now, right? Because I only study this for a living.
There's a species of bush. There's a species of bush elephant. It's the African elephant. It's slightly smaller. It's found in the Congo, and it was in the last 40 odd years they proved the bush elephant is a separate species. So the Congo does have these big creatures that are actually new to science and are separate.
That's amazing.
So can I get a tiny elephant? Is that possible? Ask him for a friend.
Okay, if you want to get into pygmy elephants, Wrangel Island to the north of Russia had woolly mammoths up until 4,000 years ago. It was the last woolly mammoths left on Earth, but these creatures came up to our shoulder because things... Yeah, right? Pygmy woolly mammoths, shoulder height.
That's adorable.
How is that the first I know of this? That's the best thing I never knew until right fucking now.
Rob, will you buy me one, please?
Yes.
Thank you. We can ride it together into glory.
Patreon money will finally be put to use. Good use.
It's like riding a Shetland pony, but it's a little hairy elephant.
It's adorable.
It's something I came across in my archaeological research because I was trying to research the extinction of the woolly mammoths, and they all go extinct in North Africa. In North America, about sort of like 16,000 to 12,000 years ago. They go extinct in Europe about 40,000 years ago, and then it's like 4,000 years ago they're like going strong in northern Russia, like 2000 BC, like that's like Sumerians, Babylonians, that's like civilizations we know about, and there are like woolly mammoths still living in northern Russia.
Man.
Well, shit, guys, we just missed it.
Yeah, no.
Son of a bitch. We just missed the
window was
fucking boat
right
on there. Yeah, seriously. Could have had one. No, we didn't act quick enough.
All right,
God
so,
damn it.
So bringing us back to our topic at hand.
Right, back on
in
topic.
terms of the way things evolve are not necessarily a relic species, be it hominin or you know, whatever it may be, intact. It would almost naturally have to evolve with the rest of
has
us.
to evolve.
So tell me how that might apply, but just theoretically, to the giants and the Kakamora of the Solomon Islands.
So if I'm going to refer to them as giants from here on out, but assume that Kakamoran giants in this narrative, with our like caveats that we've previously stated, they're the same thing. We're going to say that these two entities, I mean, they live in the same limestone cave systems. They both look the same. They're just different heights. I think they're the same thing, just seen at different periods in their life cycle. But say that these are to be a creature. Now, when I actually went to the island, my theory was there'd be a previously as yet undiscovered species of orangutan. And my hunt for the orangutan was like a running joke with the rest of my team, who did not believe in these stories as strongly as I did, but more fool them because I got a lot of anecdotal evidence from locals, which we can get to even later on. But I was thinking, okay, we're going to be looking for orangutan because, I mean, if you look at the sort of the geographical layout of these islands in relation to Indonesia and Malaysia, which have the orangutan, I mean, it's all kind of part of the same now submerged landmass, so it's not impossible that a creature could have been washed out to sea, or maybe a floating island made out of like forestry that's been washed down in a storm. An orangutan washes up ashore on another island. That's how a lot of animals get around. Almost all terrestrial animals you find on small islands get there by floating there on these islands made out of leaf litter. So my first thought was it could be an orangutan. But having looked deeper into the stories and having been faced with the fact that these creatures clearly have a level of sentience and behavior that seems a lot more human than it does great apish, if we go to talk about, you know, how could this creature have come into being, saying that it isn't an orangutan, but it's actually, you know, something else. So something I've come across, my archaeological research was into the Paleolithic period, which is as recent as about 16,000 years ago. That's the colonization of America by the first ever Native Americans. But it goes back as deep as maybe 2 million years ago, which is not even Homo sapiens walking around yet. We've got all the different other species of Homo. And this is what I think is interesting here to mention, is that humans, like, we kind of take it for granted that we're the only example of our species on the planet. But this is an aberration. Many animals have different examples of the same genus walking around. I mean, you get two different types of gazelle, but they're both still a gazelle. Why don't you get two different types of human? And historically, we actually did. And about 2 million years ago, you get this out of Africa movement. Homo ergaster are sort of our earliest origins within the genus Homo. Homo ergaster are living in Africa. They're upright. They're making tools. They even maybe have the semblance of language. They're starting to be omnivorous. They're walking around. This is a sort of descendant of Australopithecus. You've made your way through to Homo ergaster. When ergaster leaves Africa and it goes east 2 million years ago, it evolves into Homo erectus, which we have in the archaeological record making its way as far east as Indonesia. But of course, all these islands in, you know, periods of ice age are not going to be isolated islands. They're going to be a lot more connected. Whether the Solomon Islands are connected or not is something I don't really have the authority to discuss. But you get Erectus moving east. Then ergaster stays in Africa, but then ergaster gives rise to Heidelbergensis, or which is also known as Rhodesia man. And Heidelbergensis is the sort of common ancestor of both Homo sapiens, which is what we are, and also Homo Neanderthal or Neanderthalensis, depending, which are living in Europe. And then you've got the Denisovans, which are living in Eurasia and Asia. So at this period, you've got Homo sapiens living in Africa, you've got Neanderthals in Europe, and you've got Denisovans in Asia. And the archaeology of Indonesia, India, places like this isn't actually so forthcoming. But I remember I spoke to my professor when I was still studying this, and he said, we assume there's another kind of archaic hominin living there. We just don't have that archaeological record, not because of anything mysterious, but just because archaeology in rainforests and tropical regions is very difficult. which is something I experienced personally when I was trying to do my research in the Solomon Islands. But it's another reason why, despite Africa being the birthplace of humanity, so little archaeological research can be done out there, especially in like the Congo and West Africa, where it becomes more lush. You can't really do research in these areas. So there's swathes of humanity we know very little about, because the archaeology is not so forthcoming. But we do know that there is a time period when you have Heidelbergensis, you have Neanderthalensis, you have Denisovans, you have Homo sapiens, and possibly other hominins in India and Southeast Asia, all living at roughly the same period.
Oh, wow.
And when Homo sapiens first go into Europe, they make it as far as the Levant, and it's about 200,000 years ago. And they interact with Neanderthals. And at this point, the speciation isn't so great that Neanderthals and humans can't reproduce. They're different species already, but they're able to interbreed and produce viable offspring, which you find in the archaeological remnants of Israel to this day. I think Skul and Qafsa are two archaeological sites out there which have these, they look really Neanderthal in their brow ridges, but they have prominent chins. And Homo sapien are the only species of Homo to actually have a chin. Everything else, it all slopes away from the teeth going back towards the neck. So you have these these hybrids being born. Then climactic changes occur and humans retreat back, Homo sapiens rather, retreat back into Africa. And about 70,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, it's uncertain, they move back into Europe. And at this point, they're distinct enough from Neanderthals that there's less interbreeding. There's now clearly distinct differences between them. But the first successful out of Africa movement made by Homo sapiens isn't into Europe, but it's actually east, out of the Horn of Africa, around the Arabian Gulf, into India and down into Indonesia. And this happens about 70,000 years ago. And this movement of humans interact with Neanderthals, they interact with Denisovans, which is why, if you're doing genetic studies, it is Aborigines and Melanesians that have the highest percentage of Neanderthal and Denisovan genetics in them to this day. Because it's amazing when you look at it. I mean, the most genetically diverse humans are Africans. The genetically least diverse humans are actually European Homo sapiens, who have a tiny amount of Neanderthal in them. But the largest amount of Neanderthal is actually found in Melanesians and in Aborigines, because they're part of this first human movement 70,000 years ago. They're moving east. They're interacting with other archaic hominins which are living in these areas, but they're not so distinct at this point that they can't interbreed with each other. And so they carry this genetics with them as they move eastwards. And my hypothesis regarding these giants in Melanesia, from everything we've been saying about all these Solomon Island giants, they sound to me they have the level of intelligence, they have language, they have not necessarily music, but they can make sounds that they're curious in. So they have an element of curiosity, which is a very human trait. The ability to imagine is almost exclusively human. But these creatures clearly have something like that going on. They have language, they can make tools, and a lot of the sounds to me like the behavior of early hominids, not necessarily Homo sapiens, but, as far back as Erectus, were making tools. And as we know from the archaeological record, humans have been able to actually interact with the other creatures. Even as they evolve, they're evolving in tandem, and a limited amount of social interaction means speciation is occurring. But at the same time, a Denisovan can give its genetics to an early Homo sapien on its way to Melanesia. These exchanges can still occur. I know I'm kind of going on a massive rambling tangent right now.
But you're taking us to where we need to be, so it's all good, man. Take the road that you most feel comfortable on.
This is like the most intelligent conversation I've ever been a part of. So thank you, Nikolaus.
Sorry,
and Robert.
Yeah, it's very late here in Britain, and I've had a bit to drink. Honestly though, that is fascinating. I clearly know about Heller space and Genesee beer, but you explaining that as far as the movement and the different versions and species of
That's it's fucking mind blowing.
So what I'm trying to say here is that human species, I'm not saying human species, all genuses of Homo, I'm referring to as human here, they were all able to evolve at the same time. They could interbreed with each other, which will come up when I get round to my anecdotal evidence, but they were able to interact with each other while at the same time being distinctly different and evolving in tandem. And as such, I think it's not impossible that, I mean, if Erectus can make it as far as Indonesia, I mean, we don't know much about in the way of like land bridges or whether they were capable of building boats, but there are some parts that Erectus was able to traverse that would never have had land bridges. The assumption is even these early humans were able to construct some kind of flotation device, which means it's plausible they could have made it as far as the Solomon Islands and have continued to evolve, on an isolated island, as Rob was saying earlier, down their own path through till this day. They've continued to evolve. They're no longer Erectus. They're no longer a creature caught in time. They're not like the stories that the Mokele Mbembe is a sauropod. These are modern creatures, as evolved as they need to be to live in the environment in which they find themselves. But they could very well be historically a distant relation of Homo sapien, maybe a Homo erectus that has now evolved into something entirely new. But still able to actually interact and interbreed with humans, which we'll get to in a moment. But now that my lecture is finished, please, guys, any questions? I'm so sorry.
Great one. Are you kidding? There is nothing you need to apologize for. I've been grinning ear to fucking ear. Thank you.
That seriously is like the most interesting fucking thing I've heard last 6 months.
No, because literally my knowledge of human evolution I get from like reruns of Nova. I'll be the first to admit. We are not scholars. We are doing our best to waddle through some crazy ass shit here, and so it really helps us to have a pro come in and take the reins and break it the fudge down. So thank you,
guys. I'm so great because I love what you guys talk about, and like I believe it all as well. But like I have to have the science back it up before I can start making claims. So like I looked into this. I'm like, is it possible that like a Homo erectus descendant could be living on the Solomon? And I did all the numbers. I ran through the deep time history of the Homo sapiens and Homo everything. I'm like, yes, it is possible. There is the potential that had happened.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
We need more of you, honestly, and less of us. Because, you're getting done doing the math.
Yeah, I mean, I was getting all excited about all I can think about is like, oh, dude, a bunch of Sasquatches got in the fucking Mayflower, and we're like, fuck this, and then took off.
Wow,
we're going to the New World.
That's also valid science in some parts. So let's
for sure.
It's the kryptonite science.
Yeah, totally.
And I love it. I love that science.
We will jump from PBS, God bless you, Nick, to Jerry Springer. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the accounts you talked about, which was a woman called Mango. Can you tell us a little bit about her? And this stems from what you're discussing about the possibility of interbreeding through these different species, though you say the speciation is pretty severe at this point, but still being a potential.
Yeah, so speciation could potentially still be occurring. I mean, we know from historical evidence that humans can interbreed with the other Homo species found on the planet. It happened a lot in the same sapiens group that made its way out to Melanesia. I'm just looking for the Mango story as I talk to you. I'm just scrolling through my document. So yes, this is all possible. I'm just going to Control F and find Mango. But as far as like local stories, if we're going to just drop the science completely, and if we're just going to focus on like folkloric tales, they don't, much like the Mokele Mbembe, they don't say this is a Homo erectus offshoot. They just talk about these giants. They talk about these giants, which they totally believe in. Some group, I mean, many believe in them up to this day. Not all of them believe they're still around, but they all believe in that they existed until very recently. But a lot of them sort of talk about these giant hairy creatures as being able to interact and interbreed with humans. So there are many stories coming from Guadalcanal, Choiseul, Santa Isabella, Malaysia, Makira, all these islands and Solomon Islands, which have stories of the giants. These stories can include monumental burial grounds full of gigantic bones, houses, the supports of which are made of 8-foot-tall human femurs,
hold on, just one second.
I know.
Houses built out of the bones of giants.
Houses built out of the bones of giants, exactly.
That is fucking amazing.
That's the best.
Never seen any photos, but I read accounts of like they know a guy who knows a guy who comes from a village where the meeting house has bones of giants being like the support poles. And
oh my God.
again, it's just a great story, no matter how much is around that, but that's just great. But then there are a lot of stories of abduction too. And one of the stories, which was recorded by an Australian guy called Boyrayon, who compiled most of the folkloric stories into a single account. And he himself doesn't strike me as a plausible guy, but what he has done is he has compiled every folkloric story he found and put it into a single place, and that's what I was reading. And he tells the story of a woman called Mango. So she went missing, and 25 years later, this woman, Mango, is rediscovered in a village garden, heavily pregnant and hysterically frothing from the mouth. And it becomes apparent subsequently that a giant had taken her as his wife. She'd been kidnapped by a giant, taken off into the forest, and for 25 years had been living with them. It's pretty problematic, like the idea of being taken as a wife. It's all pretty gross, but that seems to be what's happened. This woman's been taken away into the forest, and she's managed to break free. She is on the verge of it. Like, she might very well be insane, but she's lost a lot of what made her human during this period, but she's heavily pregnant.
Well, a quarter of a century going native is going to be pretty easy, I'd imagine.
Living with something that is not your species. And though mentally unstable, and she resisted capture, she was desperate to not be caught by humans. She's eventually restrained and she's brought back into society. And though she's never again compos mentis, she does eventually give birth. Descriptions of the child are not provided in any anecdotes, but the child was considered an aberration by the villagers, and after 5 years was killed by the villagers. Not just the villagers, I didn't put this into the account I sent to you, but by the woman's family. They put this child to death because this child was considered, an abomination.
An abomination. I mean, I can see where all cultures really have strict rules about all sorts of things that are really probably good in terms of mating, but interspecies is probably one of the most taboo, I think almost universally.
I think it is.
It's across the board fucked up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I guess maybe, especially if it was something bigger and more aggressive. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I would love if this child, if indeed it ever happened, but if it survived, it would be phenomenal. It reminds me of that story, like Zara or something from the outlying Russian states somewhere in the early 20th century. Do you remember this at all, Mark?
Yes.
I do, yeah. Actually, I do, yeah.
I can't, I'm going to be horrible on the details, but it's not the only time I've ever heard of a woman being abducted. The whole Highway of Tears in Canada, there's been sources that have told me about Sasquatch abductions. And while real serial killers are obviously creating mayhem in that area, there are some people that think that it's the same thing. And it's interesting to think that that interbreeding, A, would be something they would be into, and B, that it would be even possible, and then what the results could be. I mean, like I say, this is where it gets into a little Jerry Springer, but it's both terrifying and absolutely fascinating.
Well, if we're going to get into archaeology for a sec, sorry, I cut you off, Mark. I apologize.
Oh no, you're good. You're good.
If we're to get into archaeology for a second, in the occasions where we see that humans and Neanderthals have interbred and produced offspring, which you see mainly in Israel about 200,000 years ago, they have qualities of both species. But at that later period, about 60,000 years ago, when humans now repopulating Europe, there's a little bit of overlap, much less. But what it seems, if you look at the genetic history, is that it is Neanderthals taking human women and impregnating them. It doesn't seem to happen in the reverse. Neanderthals are behaving in a way we would consider far more savage towards Homo sapiens than the other way around. Or the other alternative is humans have enough sociality in them that they're agreeing to raise the offspring of women abducted by Neanderthals, but still raise them as a part of society, whereas Neanderthals are not doing the same if it happens in reverse. But there are accounts of this happening interspecies in the archaeological record. And also the Zara story you mentioned, I have heard of too. There's a lot of Yeti folklore that comes out of the Urals in Russia as well. And I think that's where that story comes from that you mentioned just then.
Yeah, Almas and the creatures that are literally described much more Neanderthal-like than they are ape-like.
Yes. And I think it's possible. We could almost envisage these giants as being more Neanderthal-like than ape-like. I mean, their sloping brows, their lack of a chin, that's all Neanderthal characteristics. Their wide mouths and wide noses. I mean, we assume apes because the stories tell apes, but when you look at these physical descriptors, this is what, if we've recreated the skull morphology of Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthalensis, they have these prominent brows, no chins, wide mouths, big noses. So this is very similar to the Ulmer's story coming out of the Urals as well, I feel.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and they are pretty unique, which to me indicates much more likely that there are some sort of proto-humanoids, hominins, whatever the word would be, out there that may have managed to survive when it seemed like we were the last man standing, as it were. But maybe there is that thin chance. I think there's other things like the Agawi in East Africa, things that definitely smack of more ape-like in appearance, and maybe a variation that hasn't been discovered yet. But there are certainly some that seem to be us earlier, not us specifically speaking, like in a direct line, but earlier versions of humanity.
I think so. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing is, it is almost arrogant of humanity to assume we're the only versions of our genus left on Earth, because that is not normal for animals, and it was not even normal for humans until relatively recently in the sort of deep time history of the Earth. It is so recent that humans became the only Homo walking around on Earth. And most animals have other versions of their genus scuttling, walking, and flying around in other parts of the world. So it's almost arrogant for us to assume that we are not like the rest of the world, and there are not holdouts of other genuses that can survive in these isolated locations, these inhospitable locations humans can't enter, that are sort of supporting the development and adaptation of other human groups, or homo groups, hominid groups.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And you more than most, anyone I can think of off the top of my head that I know at all, Nick, are equipped to say that this world is not as deeply scanned and explored, despite GPS and satellite imagery and all the great things that have made, given us a plethora of knowledge and made the world seem so small. It really hasn't been scanned to the nth degree like a lot of people assume it has.
You're absolutely right there. That is so true. I mean, the world is definitely getting smaller. That's what people always say. But if my recent research has proved anything, like, you can still make these amazing discoveries in regions that no one's ever heard of. And when I looked at Columbangara, I think is 685 square miles. It's not huge, but it's big. And you look at the interior of this island, it is just a volcano covered in jungle. And nobody goes in there. Everyone sticks to the coast. And you think, if there ever was a species to not be found, it would be in places like this, because these places still exist. Despite what we think these days, these places are everywhere. It is plausible. And discoveries like the tuatara and the coelacanth just prove the fact that these creatures and these species thought lost to history, lost to the world, are actually surviving in certain isolated locations. It's not improbable.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say, it's not improbable.
Oh, no, it's not only not improbable, it's likely. I mean, what we're talking about, we're not even talking about oceans. I mean, not to go into left field too far, but I mean, it's unfathomable for me to think that we're even close to cataloging not only the things that we think are relics, but the things that we haven't even fathomed yet.
Exactly. There's so much that our current science is capable of cataloging that it has not yet done, let alone those levels of science we're not yet capable of comprehending.
I couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. So getting back to these creatures, we were talking a little bit earlier, dropping a little bit of hints, and I want to start exploring this about some of the anecdotal evidence that you might have come across in your pursuit for the truth.
Yes, my pursuit for the truth. So I had definitely thought I would do a lot more of this when I was actually in country, but in the end, my research kind of precluded, my archaeological research precluded my cryptozoological research. But so to give a little bit of background, not far from Columbangara is the island of Cohico. And on the island of Cohico is a community called Baboe. And a lot of the people I was working with to gain access to these tunnels, which is all on land owned by locals on Columbangara, they have family in Baboe. And they kind of said, hey, you know, could you come over and do a presentation at the Baboe Primary School about the archaeological research you're doing and tell us a bit about the Second World War? And so I did, and I made friends with one of the teachers in Baboe Primary School, which is a beautiful, tiny little primary school, about 4 teachers. There's a little sort of like lagoon. It was picturesque as anything. But one of the teachers I made friends with was a guy called Ishmael Nelsman. Ishmael Nelsman. And I wrote to him after I got back to Britain saying, I actually mentioned the podcast. I mentioned Cryptonauts, and I actually said, you know, I might.
Nice.
I've been talking to these guys, and they're very interested in the sort of mythology. I said mythology because cryptozoology. I don't want to get too caught in the weeds talking to Ishmael. I was like, the mythology of the Solomon Islands. Have you ever heard any stories of giants? And he's like, I have heard about giants. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard about these giants. They like look like apes. They attack the Japanese. And he's like, well, I don't know about them looking like apes, but my great-great-grandfather was a giant. And I was like, what? And so I'm just going to read this paragraph I've written regarding Ishmael, so we can sort of get Ishmael's story. I kind of copied and pasted the sort of essays he sent me here into this paragraph, so I'll read this to you. His great-great-grandfather had himself been a giant and a warrior hero who had been undefeated in battle, only dying eventually of extreme old age, which was a rarity in the pre-missionary times of the Solomon Islands, which the locals today will insist was a lawless place of decapitations and canoe-bound warrior raids between the islands and nothing else. I don't know how true that is, but they really fixate upon the headhunting history of the Solomon Islands when you talk to them today. But regardless, during this period of sort of warrior raids, headhunters, lived Ishmael's great-great-grandfather. And Ishmael showed me a photograph of his ancestor's birthright stone, which was a tool or a weapon which his family still cherished to this day. Ishmael sent me a photo he actually took that afternoon of the birthright stone, which is just in Ishmael's house. This is a monumental boulder that looks to be a stone club of some considerable size. It's been rounded by hand and shaped into a brutal-looking cudgel. Ishmael's family still treasure this lethal-looking rock and use it as a devil watcher. Apparently, it can predict the movement of malevolent spirits, and this demonological power, along with its inherently lethal size, proved invaluable in keeping Ishmael's ancestor alive in a number of local wars over 100 years ago. And for me, this begins to sound something like proof, because this devil watcher aligns, I feel, with the clubs that the ape men who attacked the Japanese wielded, and also the clubs that apparently the Giants of Guadalcanal still fabricate. There's a lot of stories that the Giants of Guadalcanal make stone tools. There's no photos of them. I've seen Solomon Island stone tools, and, you know, they're not particularly large, but the photo Ishmael sent to me, which I've actually sent to you guys too, like, this looks to me maybe...
Yeah, oh yeah. It's incredible.
It's a big-looking boulder, which is being clearly manipulated by hand, sort of shortened in the middle with 2 like large bulbous ends. Like, This is a big boulder made into a club. And
I don't know who could wield this. Like, I can't imagine what Goliath asked. Man, it would take.
That's the thing. Like, this is a gigantic stone tool, and you have to be a giant to wield it. And it's an interesting little aside I'll add here. We've found a lot of Homo ergaster and Homo erectus hand axes that look too big to wield. These things, because most hand axes you find as an archaeologist fit into a modern human hand, but you find some that are nearly a foot long. You find gigantic stone tools being made by Homo erectus and Homo ergaster. And I just find that interesting that these proto-humans are making these stone tools, and then we have a look at this modern stone tool wielded by someone's great-great-grandfather that is of the size of the stone tools being made by certain Homo erectus groups.
Does that imply to you, as an archaeologist, that they just had a lot more strength than modern humans?
For sure, most proto-humans, archaic hominins, had greater strength than humans. I read this interesting thing where the average strength of the average Neanderthal would have been able to beat a bodybuilder like Arnold Schwarzenegger in in an arm wrestle any day. They were just inherently stronger creatures than a Homo sapien. Homo sapiens were taller, and we had the advantage that we could walk long distances without needing to restock our foodstuffs. It's what gave us the competitive advantage over other proto-humans, the fact that we can walk for hours without needing to top up on food and resources, whereas these smaller, squatter, but far more powerfully built humans need to constantly stock up on food to maintain that level of energy. But proto-humans and archaic humans were much stronger than us, yes.
Okay.
Huh. Interesting.
So
if the giant, sorry,
please, no. I think you're going to go where I was just going to ask.
yeah.
So just
I was
take
going
it.
to say, if the giants are descended from proto-humans, then it makes sense that that level of strength has translated into their modern forms. We're not as strong as a Neanderthal because we're not descended from Neanderthals. We were concurrent with Neanderthals, and we ultimately wiped them out. But if these entities in the Solomon Islands are descended from one of the stronger versions of the genus Homo, like the Denisovans or the Neanderthals or something else entirely,
Right.
then they could very well be a lot stronger and able to wield much larger stone tools, such as what Ishmael's great-great-grandfather was using.
Which hurt me
100 or so
just to
years
look
ago.
at the picture, I'll be honest.
Oh, yeah,
Like,
I could not lift
I
that.
strained a muscle just looking at the image.
I get that. I totally get that.
It is kind of fascinating, though, that he's saying that his great-great-grandfather was a giant. So that's obviously assuming that there was some sort of interbreeding that happened there. And then this guy's basically claiming to be the descendant of a giant. Like,
Well, exactly.
that's pretty fascinating.
I think, on the whole, in the Solomon Islands, interbreeding with giants is taken for granted. It's assumed you can do it. And Ishmael actually attested that Ishmael told me the giants he knew of don't have the ape-like qualities we've heard in other accounts. He tells me they look like regular men, but they are very huge, which is interesting. But then again, all the other accounts I've heard don't necessarily paint them to be apes. They just paint them to not look entirely human. But then again, a Neanderthal, an Erectus, a Heidelbergensis wouldn't look entirely human either. Certainly not a descendant of one of these creatures.
Yeah. And that's fascinating.
And going beyond that, before we sort of say that men such as his ancestors, maybe they're just remarkably large and powerful representatives of our own species, Ishmael went on to tell me that the giants lived in the mountains and slept in big tall trees called abalolo. His own family's gigantic progenitor, however, did not sleep in abalolo trees, but dwelled in caves for his safety. So this gets interesting because clearly they're looking to be human, but they're not behaving in an entirely human manner. In fact, they're behaving a lot like Kakamora and giants. They're building settlements and trees, but also, I think more importantly here, is that they're living in caves, which is exactly how we understand Kakamora and the Giants of Guadalcanal to be habiting. And the giants that sort of gave birth to Ishmael after, 3 degrees of generation are also living in caves as well. So they're living in the same habitat, the same environment, which I find very interesting.
What I also find intriguing, too, is that the story that first brought this all to your attention, which, of course, was the occupying Japanese forces being, lying in wait for the American Marines to land and suddenly getting attacked by the indigenous population, which happened to be, these monstrous early humans, for lack of a better adjective. The warlike quality that seemed to have been represented in Ishmael's great-great-grandfather seems to be intact. Like they were capable, even though I know we all want to cringe when I call this evolution, but they evolved to the point of organized warfare. And I know some chimp groups do that, but very few animals. We know the natural world is violent as all get out, but organized warfare is pretty unique to very, very few species. And that I think is another bit of possible evidence to indicate that these things were an altogether different breed of cat.
I think so entirely. I mean, you need to have a level of intelligence to be able to perform war. Like, war is something different from just, scrapping over food and mates. And, I mean, we could get into the discussions that maybe the Japanese are interfering with the territory of the giants, but on the whole, the Giants don't attack Solomon Islanders. And there's actually a lot of quite fun narratives about the fact that the Giants were fighting on behalf of the Solomon Islands. They were their own sort of like independence resistance group.
Sort of like the Golems allegedly, defending the fraught Jewish communities in the Great World Wars.
Yeah, the golems of Prague protecting the Jews from Nazi persecution. That's exactly what I thought when I read about the Giants of Guadalcanal, sort of singling out the Japanese to attack them, because the Americans don't seem to encounter giants, but the Japanese
just
do.
Out of a curiosity, I don't know much about the Japanese occupation of Solomon Islands. Were they pretty brutal to the locals?
Yes, they were.
I'm not surprised.
No. Yeah, from what we've if you hear about sort of like what happened on the Burmese Railroad and things like that, I mean, thousands of prisoners of war were killed on the Burmese Railroad, but the vast majority of people killed on the Burmese Railroad were indigenous people press ganged into building the railroad. And the same thing happened. I interviewed a lot of locals to get local stories about the Second World War. And the principal of the school I gave the talk at, Principal Panda was his name. He told me about both his grandfathers had been kidnapped by the Japanese to work as slave labor in Bougainville. Luckily, both men were able to evade their captors. One dived off a boat and the other cut his bonds free while he was tied up in the forest, and they both managed to escape. But I mean, it was brutal treatment that they were receiving at the hands of the Japanese, which is why they all sort of teamed up and worked alongside the Allies as well. I mean, you get so many stories of indigenous heroism fighting on behalf of the Allies, which is another podcast entirely, I think.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Not ours, clearly. But it certainly deserves its own podcast. So
we can't cover that stuff.
So just speculating wildly, it could almost be, one could say hypothetically, that it saw its people that lived, peacefully coexisted with, even occasionally interbred with, people that it saw maybe not as itself, but as similar or akin to them.
Symbiotic.
Yes, perfect. Yeah. Perfect. Being laid into by the Japanese, and that might have been like the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back.
There's a lot of speculation that was the case, because if you read these anecdotes, I mean, the humans of the coast fear the interior, and they look upon the giants with a sense of awe. But giants can talk. There's actually examples of a group of giants that were feeding cannibalistically off humans, but then a local village representative actually parlayed with the giants and negotiated a truce. Now, a lot of this is this mythology, is this folklore, but they interact, but they kind of like leave each other alone, but they have a sort of a generally tense but not openly antagonistic relationship with each other. They're able to negotiate, and they're obviously able to interbreed, and it's not always bad stories that are being told about the giants. The giants are almost treated... The giants are truth in the eyes of many Solomon Islanders, and the giants just live in the interior like humans live on the exterior. They have their realms. They interact with each other sometimes. Sometimes they interbreed. Sometimes there's conflict. Often it's just perfectly pleasant, if not slightly curious, interaction between the two species. And it's very possible that maybe the giants see the humans that they interact with on the coast being sort of brutalized by a new group of interlopers, and maybe they took issue with that. It's not beyond the level of intelligence that at this point we are giving the Giants of Guadalcanal.
Right on. Here's hoping. I mean, it's great to think that even... there's so much divisiveness going on today, as in every other age in humanity. It's great to see things that you may not even be the same species, but are like, you know what? When push comes to shove, dicks are dicks, and we're gonna come up and help you.
They got
fuck those guys.
They got a great little back and forth, working relationship. We're like, you know what? We're gonna fucking step in, take care of our boys. We got their back.
Don't worry, we're gigantic.
Literally, you're talking about fucking giants here. So, good luck fighting them.
Can we just for 1 second just take a moment though to put our feet in the other shoes and think? As you said and read earlier, Nick, you're young, you're far from home, you're a Japanese soldier, you're conscripted, You're fighting this war for Hirohito and pride in country and all the things you've been taught, because, each country has its own jingoism and you get swept up in it. And I'm not here to judge where these kids came from at all. And you're just in this fucking harsh island. It's terrible. You're waiting for this, oppressive force from a nation you've been taught is evil. And suddenly these lumbering, massive, perhaps somewhat hairier than normal human Goliaths come in with these hyper cudgels of hewn stone, just crushing and bashing and screaming in the darkness and the rain. Holy fuck. What a living nightmare.
It would fuck you up. It absolutely would.
Yeah, literally all pants will be shat, as Chris would say, but he's not here. So,
I'm glad you said it for him.
Yeah, that one's for you, buddy.
No, that's a lifetime of fucking therapy right there.
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely.
That's crazy.
And I'm so glad you say that, though, Rob, because one of the things I was trying to when approaching this as an archaeologist is that you don't want to come in with pro one side, anti another side. And I actually come from a German family. Thankfully, none of them were really bad guys during the war. But a lot of them were conscripted into the German army during the war. And they were sent off to the Eastern Front, actually. And that's a whole other story. It's very tragic. My great-great-grandfather, my Opa's father, was actually sent down uranium mines in the 50s, still as a prisoner of war. And so, it kind of I grew up knowing you can't really be one side's good, the other side's bad. So I actually looked at this from the perspective of being for the Japanese, there were some monsters, but you know what? There would have been some human beings too in the Japanese army.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's just kids who've been conscripted. They've been fed all this. And I've actually read a lot of accounts of Japanese soldiers who fought in the Solomons and in the Philippines. I try to do a very broad level of research when I'm working on this. And they were totally, duped by the propaganda of the time. They go out there to fight for their emperor, and they are terrified of the Americans. They know the Americans are evil, but most Japanese soldiers knew there was no way they could win against a full-on American war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to cripple the American Navy, and if they didn't cripple them, if they didn't cripple the Navy on that particular attack, then they knew the war was lost. And they didn't manage to cripple the Navy. They didn't manage to sink any of the Japanese aircraft carriers. The Japanese didn't manage to sink any American aircraft carriers. And the Japanese knew from that point forwards the war was lost. So they're terrified of the Americans, and they're on this hostile island. And I've actually been excavating and working in the dugouts that these Japanese were having to call their home during that conflict. And it would have been a nightmare trying to live in this stifling, mosquito-ridden jungle. It's full of saltwater crocodiles, and you're being bombed day by day. The Americans are far better prepared. They have a far better equipment for dealing with this kind of stuff, and there's just more of them. And then at the same time, just on your rear, you have these fucking giant apes just beating the shit out of you with cudgels. It would have been a shit show for the Japanese.
Yeah.
I was going to say, with everything going on, you don't forget about the giants attacking you from the south. So everything seems good, and then all of a sudden you're fucked.
If anything, my heart goes out.
Yeah, man, that's crazy.
I feel bad. I actually found a lot of different stories of Japanese encountering cryptozoological things during the war in the Pacific. I read about apparently at Okinawa, the Japanese were walking along the beach, and they came across, all the bodies of their friends and comrades who'd been killed in the fighting, washed ashore, covered in sort of 6-foot wide crabs eating them.
Yes.
And I'm just holy fucking hell.
It's so weird.
Yeah, Jesus.
And it's funny, along the same lines, I think it was after the Battle of Okinawa. And I've read the crab one, and some people surmise it was giant spider or something. But there's a whole other offshoot story that says they were octopus-like creatures that were devouring the dead, and that when they heard noises, they would turn their tentacles into rigid stalks, get themselves up higher to see who was coming, then go back down and continue to feast on the dead.
I hate that. I hate that.
Yes, it's the worst thing ever. Just
that's terrible.
Eating monster landopus.
The landopus. We got there, baby. We got to the landopus.
Finally. It's been a long time coming, but we got there.
After all these years, terrestrial.
After all these
Pod
years,
over. We've achieved.
Yeah, there it is. Awesome. Nick, thank you so very much for coming on, man. This has seriously been one of the most fucking fascinating / educational conversations I've ever had. Thank you so much
Yeah,
No,
you're
seriously,
phenomenal.
man. It's so awesome to have, because you're out there, man. You're boots in the field. You are our modern day fucking Indiana Jones. You're also a Patreon supporter. Thank you so very much, there,
Absolutely.
Nick.
Everyone should be a Patreon supporter.
Yeah, it's totally. Oh, thank you. It's totally so awesome, man, to have you on. This has been such a great conversation.
Absolute
Thank you
pleasure.
for all your information.
Yeah.
Can you let people know again where they can find you?
Okay, yeah. People can find me on Instagram at Nick Swift Diggs. That's NIKSWIFT. I'm also, as I said, launching a TeePublic account. So that is Nick Swift Draws, NIKSWIFT because I'm actually no longer working for the university thanks to coronavirus. So I thought I would try to raise money by making T-shirts because I enjoy doing art.
Yeah.
I got into Photoshop as of a week ago, and my
Nice.
not very good Photoshop drawings are already for sale as T-shirts. And if anyone wants to tweet at me, I'm at Nick and Daniel, NIKANDDANIEL. So that's where you guys can find me.
Awesome. Also, too, you have ForgottenFortress.com that you will be updating at some point in the future with all your new info on there.
Absolutely right. So at the moment, I'm putting most of my updates onto Instagram, but I'm going to try and put that all onto Forgotten Fortress at some point when I have time, which is weird to say because I have no job and I just am in my house all the time thanks to COVID-19. So I should always have time, and yet somehow I don't.
No,
that's the way it
dude,
works.
Yeah, believe me, same
All
thing
of
here.
us are in
Bobby,
that boat.
I know.
yeah, exactly. So, Bobby, what do you got for closing comments?
I
What do
got
you got,
closing
buddy?
comments, man. Nick, again, it's amazing what you've done. It's great that you took the time out of your legitimate, extraordinary work to do some, boot on the boots groundwork, as Mark would just say, for the actual cryptozoological cause while you're in one of these corners of the world that so very few of us ever get to, much less any of us that A, have an interest in this, and B, have the scientific backup to do a solid job picking brains. So I just want to say, for all of us out here who are fascinated by this stuff, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you for bringing it to
pleasure.
us.
Honestly,
Yeah,
no,
totally.
I'm so grateful that you guys actually had me on and you wanted me to do this interview. I realize I've talked at you for I think the majority of this. I mean, what I really like about the Cryptonaut podcast is listening to three of you engaging back and forth, and I definitely feel I sat you guys down, got out my whiteboard, and started drawing diagrams of out of Africa dispersals.
Dude, this is the shit that I need to anchor me back to reality, because I'm still like, dude, Sasquatch are in the boat. They're in the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and they're fucking going to Antarctica for the ice wall and the lizard people. So I need someone like you to step in occasionally and be like, hey, Mark, here's some actual fucking education and science. Because shockingly, I never finished college. Who would thought? So
Yes, no,
it's good to have the
We
info.
are two-man college dropouts. That is
Yes, exactly.
And yet you guys do something that I admire so much and I respect to such a huge extent.
It's the one thing that we got that we've managed to work. It only took us a little bit longer than it should have, but we managed to pull it together.
I love what you guys do so much. I listen to your podcast when I'm like working on this project. I'm like, God, I wish I was doing a cryptozoology podcast. Those guys have so much fun. And like that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, man,
we're sitting there, why can't we go to the Solomon Islands and do something useful with our wasted lives?
It's because Mark doesn't understand math or where north is. Oh,
Well,
Mark never graduated. Yeah, so does Chris.
Mark, Rob, Chris, I have a proposal for you guys. I'm probably going to be making a return trip to the Solomon Islands after all this COVID-19 stuff blows over. I don't want to say too much with too much poise, but I've been talking to some pretty interesting people who sound like they're pretty interested in putting money into a return expedition to properly investigate and record the Japanese ruins out there. And you always need a team. So what I could say is you guys more than welcome to actually accompany me out there. I can go off and do the archaeology. You guys will have to be there for boots on ground. You have the entire Solomon Islands to explore, to talk to people. You could speak to all the people I've used as sources in my article. They're all going to be there. I mean, this is something that you guys could do if you came out with me next time. Just going to put that out there.
Holy shit. I mean, wow, that's huge. That's gigantic.
Yeah, that's one of the most incredible offers I've ever received.
Yeah, seriously, unfortunately, I don't know how much vacation time I have from work, and my wife will definitely kill me. So I'm going to leave this up to Rob and Chris.
Of course. No, I totally appreciate that. I have the great benefit of being unemployed thanks to the virus, and then I'll be moving to America soon, where due to legal reasons, I have to be legally unemployed for a certain period of time anyway. So There's a lot of time
gotcha.
for me to do a lot of groundwork to set up the next expedition. But yes, if I can get funding, I'll bring you guys with me, and I can just send you off to interview locals relating to their.
Perfect.
There's a lot of folklore out there. I mean, this is a weird thing to drop right at the end of the podcast, but there are legit flying reptilians and UFO based in Guadalcanal too.
You know, it's funny. We didn't even get to the roping. Yes.
I know.
All
Yeah.
right, well, you know what? We got time for a part 2 at some point coming up in the near future, so
sure.
that'll end up working out totally.
No,
totally
Legends
so
of the
well.
Solomon Island with
totally.
Nikolaus Cox. Yeah, absolutely. I smell part 2 on the wind.
Yeah,
Gentlemen,
definitely.
it would be
Awesome.
an honor. This has been such a great joy and a pleasure to be a part of tonight.
Man. No, definitely, man. Thank you so much for coming on. So
Thank you.
there you have it. Thank you all so very much for joining us, Cryptonaut Podcast, the Instas, the Twitters, the Facebooks, all the social medias, everything going on out there. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, quarantine, do
Wash
what
your
you gotta do.
hands.
Wash
All
your
the time.
hands, yes, and don't fucking sneeze on people for Christ's sakes. And use, hand sanitizer, and you know what? Better yet, just don't fucking leave your house. Nikolaus came back from a fucking expedition, and he went right into fucking quarantine. So you know what? If Nikolaus can do it, we all can do it. There
honor
you
me.
have it, Nikolaus. Thank you so very much for joining us, my dude, and we're talking to you soon,
Talk to you soon.
Robert.
What? Do I have to add
See you
something
later.
now? Oh, do I have
No,
to say
saying
goodbye?
see you-
I'm sorry. I'm basking in the glory of Nick right now. The joy of having learned something, being blown away. So just let me enjoy this basking glow.
I'm now
I just wanted to say
basking
bye
in
to
your
you, buddy.
praise. So this is
It's a
Nice.
mutual
Nice.
bask off.
All right, I was just
basking,
trying
baby.
to. I was just trying to say bye to you, Rob. That's all. I miss you. All right, we're talking to you
I
soon.
miss you too. Bye, Nick. Bye, Mark.
Bye, guys.
Shoo.